The radio crackled with static, and somewhere in the dust-bitten distance, a convoy of 8 armored vehicles sat stalled on a road that wasn't supposed to exist on any map they carried. Sergeant First Class Marcus Hale slammed his palm against the hood of the lead truck, swearing at a sky that refused to cool, while his platoon waited for a decision nobody seemed willing to make. "We don't need her input," he barked when someone suggested calling the operations tent. "She's just support. She pushes paper. Get me a real shooter on the line." But the truth he refused to see was that the road ahead curved into a wadi the satellite imagery had quietly mislabeled. And the only person who had flagged that discrepancy 3 days earlier was the quiet intelligence analyst he kept calling sweetheart in the chow hall. Specialist Elena Reyes was already standing behind him, holding the corrected overlay in her hand, waiting for him to stop shouting long enough to listen. She had seen what no one else had bothered to read in the morning brief: 5 separate locations along this route where the terrain didn't match the grid. 5 places where a vehicle could disappear into a culvert nobody had cleared. "So I want to ask you something before we go any further. Do the people behind the mission deserve the same respect as the people in front of it? Drop your answer in the comments, because tonight, the desert is about to teach Marcus Hale exactly that." Elena Reyes did not grow up dreaming of medals or parades or the kind of stories that ended with flags folded into triangles. She grew up in a small Arizona town where her father worked nights as a long-haul dispatcher, sitting at a kitchen table covered in maps and route slips, tracing highways with a yellow pencil that never seemed to wear down. She would sit across from him with a glass of milk and watch the way his mind organized chaos into columns, the way he answered 3 phones at once without ever raising his voice, the way drivers 2,000 miles away trusted him to know what they could not see. Her mother was a hospital records clerk, a woman who kept the lives of strangers organized in alphabetical folders. And Elena learned early that the people who held things together were often the people no one thanked. She watched her parents work in visible jobs with visible pride, and somewhere between her 10th and 12th birthday, she decided that being unseen was not the same as being unimportant. When she enlisted at 19, her recruiter assumed she would want something glamorous, something with a uniform photograph worth posting online. But Elena asked instead about the military occupational specialty for intelligence analysts. She wanted the maps. She wanted the data. She wanted to be the person who looked at 1,000 pieces of information and saw the one piece that mattered. Her cousin, who had served 2 tours as an infantryman, laughed when she told him. He said the infantry was where the real soldiers went, and analysts were just glorified librarians with security clearances. She did not argue with him, because she had learned from her father that arguments rarely changed minds, but quiet competence eventually did. So she signed her contract on a Tuesday morning in a strip mall recruiting office, with rain falling against the window and a recruiter who barely remembered her name. And she promised herself something that nobody else heard. She promised that she would become the kind of soldier whose work saved lives without ever being seen, the kind of professional whose absence would be felt long before her presence was noticed. She believed, even then, that wars were not won in the moments captured on camera, but in the quiet hours of preparation that happened weeks before anyone fired a shot. She believed that the woman behind the map was just as much a warrior as the man holding the rifle, and she carried that belief like a second dog tag, hidden under her uniform, where only she could feel it pressing against her heart on the long mornings ahead. Basic training broke her down the way it broke everyone else down. But advanced individual training at Fort Huachuca was where Elena Reyes discovered that her mind was a weapon nobody had taught her how to wield. The intelligence schoolhouse was full of long days bent over maps and longer nights bent over screens, learning to read terrain the way a pianist reads sheet music, learning to spot patterns in chaos and absences in noise. She studied imagery analysis until her eyes burned, learned to identify vehicle types from grainy overhead photographs, memorized the signatures of equipment she might never see in person but might one day need to recognize in a single frame of footage. Her instructors were veterans of 2 decades of conflict, men and women who had seen the cost of missed details, and they hammered into her the same lesson over and over. Precision is mercy. Because the soldier who reads a bad map dies in a place that did not have to kill him. She learned the discipline of double-checking, the humility of triple-checking, the patience of admitting when a piece of information was not yet good enough to pass up the chain. She learned that intelligence was not about being clever. It was about being right, even when being right meant standing alone in a room of louder voices. The frustration came later, after she earned her specialty and reported to her first unit, a brigade combat team where the operations tempo was high and the patience for support personnel was low. She was 20 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and her uniform always looked a size too large no matter how many times she had it tailored. And the infantryman who passed her in the motor pool sometimes asked if she was lost. A platoon sergeant once handed her a coffee order and told her to bring it back hot. And she did, because she was new and she did not yet know how to push back. But she remembered his name, and she remembered the way he laughed at his own joke. She remembered every dismissive comment, every honey, every sweetheart. Every time someone assumed her presence in a planning meeting meant she had taken a wrong turn looking for the supply room. She did not complain to her supervisors. She did not write letters. She did not post anything online. Instead, she got better. She volunteered for the difficult shifts, the overnight watches when something might develop on the screens that nobody else wanted to monitor, the dull hours of pattern analysis that other analysts skipped. She learned the personalities of the units she supported, learned which platoon leaders read their briefings carefully and which ones only skimmed the headline. Learned how to write a product that even a tired soldier would absorb at 4 in the morning. She built her reputation one quiet correction at a time, one accurate prediction at a time, one map overlay that turned out to be exactly right when everyone else had been exactly wrong. And slowly, very slowly, a few of the older non-commissioned officers began to nod at her in the hallway, the way professionals nod at other professionals. The way her father had once nodded at the drivers who came home safe. By the time Elena deployed to her second overseas posting, her days had a rhythm that anyone who has never served would find exhausting and anyone who has served would find familiar. She woke at 4 in the morning in a plywood room that smelled of dust and diesel, laced her boots in the dark to avoid waking her roommate, and walked the gravel path to the operations center under a sky that still held a few stubborn stars. The first hour of her shift was always the briefing read, a slow, careful pass through every report that had come in overnight from sister units, partner forces, and the higher headquarters 2 time zones away. She kept a green notebook in her cargo pocket and filled it with shorthand observations, things that did not yet rise to the level of a formal product but might matter later if a pattern emerged. She attended the morning operations sync at 7, sitting along the back wall with the other support specialists, listening as the maneuver elements briefed their plans for the next 48 hours. She rarely spoke during these meetings unless asked a direct question, but she listened the way her father had once listened to truckers on the radio, hearing not just the words but the gaps between them. After the sync, she returned to her workstation and built her products, the daily intelligence summary, the route assessments, the named area of interest updates, each one stamped with her initials and reviewed by her non-commissioned officer in charge before it went out across the network. She checked her work with a discipline that bordered on superstition, because she had been taught that a comma in the wrong place could send a patrol to the wrong grid, and a grid in the wrong place could send a soldier home in a box. The afternoons were heavier than the mornings. She walked the motor pool with the maintenance team sometimes, not because intelligence had any direct stake in vehicle readiness, but because she had learned that the mechanics knew things the official reports did not capture, things about which trucks had been pulled from which patrols and why. She drank coffee in the chow hall with the communications specialists, comparing notes about radio coverage in the eastern sectors. She sat in on planning meetings for missions she would never go out on, sketching terrain on butcher paper while the platoon leaders debated breach points and rally points and contingencies. She stayed late most evenings, long after the day's shift had handed off to the night crew, because there was always one more cable to read, one more imagery cut to review, one more piece of the puzzle that might matter tomorrow. She lived on checklists, pre-mission checklists, post-mission checklists, equipment accountability checklists, communications checks at the top of every hour and the bottom of every hour and any time a patrol crossed a phase line. Her professional life was a constant act of preparation, an endless rehearsal for problems that might never come. And she had made peace with the fact that her best work would be the work that prevented disasters nobody ever knew had been possible. She was 23 years old now, a specialist on the verge of sergeant, and she carried the weight of her unit's situational awareness in a notebook the size of her hand. The mission that changed how Sergeant First Class Marcus Hale spoke to Elena Reyes for the rest of his career began on a Tuesday that started no differently than any other. A combined arms patrol was scheduled to escort a logistics convoy along Route Sapphire, a stretch of road that had been traveled dozens of times without incident, connecting the main operating base to a smaller outpost roughly 40 kilometers to the northeast. The terrain on either side was a mix of low rolling hills and dry seasonal wadis, the kind of country that looked empty until it wasn't. Elena had been monitoring activity along that corridor for 6 weeks, building a pattern of observation that nobody had specifically requested, because something in the reporting had been quietly bothering her. The local population movements did not match the season. The cell phone activity in 2 villages had dropped to nearly nothing on weekday afternoons. And most importantly, the satellite imagery from the previous month showed 5 separate locations along Route Sapphire where the road bed appeared to have been disturbed and then carefully smoothed, in patterns consistent with culvert work that no engineering unit had reported. She had flagged all of this in her weekly summary and had briefed it specifically during the Operation Sync 3 days earlier, walking the staff through the overlay she had built, pointing out each of the 5 locations on the projected map. She had used her calmest voice, the one she reserved for moments when she needed to be heard without being dismissed. And she had recommended that the convoy reroute, or at minimum dismount, and clear each of the 5 points before proceeding. Sergeant Hale had listened with his arms crossed and his expression flat. And when she finished, he had said only that the route had been used safely for months and that they were not going to slow down a logistics push because an analyst had a feeling. The operations officer, a captain who was newer to the unit than Elena was, had deferred to Hale's experience and approved the original route. Now it was Tuesday afternoon. The convoy had departed 2 hours earlier, and Elena was watching her screens with a knot in her stomach that no amount of coffee could untie. The lead vehicle reported a mechanical issue at a grid that corresponded almost exactly to the second of her 5 flagged locations. The convoy halted. The patrol leader requested guidance. The operations center filled with the controlled chaos of a problem that nobody yet understood the shape of, and Elena stood up from her workstation, picked up her notebook and her printed overlay, and walked across the room to where Sergeant Hale was now leaning over the radio. She did not announce herself. She did not say, "I told you so." She placed the overlay on the table next to him, opened her notebook to the page where she had recorded all 5 locations with their grids and her supporting analysis, and waited for him to look down. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone realizes at once that the person nobody had wanted to listen to was the only one who had been right. Hale looked at the overlay, then at her, then at the radio that was still squawking with the patrol leader's voice asking what to do next. He did not apologize, not yet, but he stepped back from the table and said, in a voice she had never heard him use before, "Reyes, walk us through it." What followed was not the kind of moment that ever makes it into a recruiting commercial, because nothing about it was loud, and nothing about it was fast, and nothing about it involved a single heroic gesture. Elena pulled a chair up to the radio table and laid her overlay flat, weighing the corners down with a coffee mug and a stapler. And she began to talk the patrol leader through what they were looking at. She spoke in the clear, unhurried cadence she had practiced for years, the cadence of someone whose words could not afford to be misunderstood. And she walked the convoy through each of the 5 locations one at a time. She told the patrol leader where to halt, how far back from the suspected disturbance to establish security, and which direction to face the dismounted soldiers based on the terrain and the likely overwatch positions she had identified in her imagery analysis. She coordinated through the operations officer to get the explosive ordnance disposal team pre-positioned at a forward node, because she had anticipated days earlier that if her assessment was correct, EOD would be the long pole in the tent, and waiting for them to drive 40 kilometers would expose the convoy for hours. She worked with the communications specialist beside her to push out updated frequency assignments so that the convoy, the EOD team, and the overwatch element from a nearby observation post could all talk on the same net without stepping on each other. She did not raise her voice once. She did not take credit for the analysis that had brought them to this point. She simply did the work, the way she had always done the work, the way her father had once worked his 3 phones at the kitchen table. Calm and exact, and entirely focused on the people on the other end of the line. The first location turned out to be exactly what she had predicted, a buried explosive device wired into a culvert that had been resurfaced to match the road. An EOD reduced it in place with a controlled detonation that sent a column of dust into the afternoon sky. The second was a decoy designed to draw a dismounted clearance team into a secondary kill zone, and Elena had anticipated this too, recommending a standoff angle that kept the soldiers clear of where the second device was eventually located in a low berm 20 meters off the shoulder. The third, fourth, and fifth were all found and cleared in sequence, each one confirming her original assessment, each one a quiet vindication she did not need spoken aloud. The convoy completed its mission 6 hours later than scheduled, but it completed its mission with every soldier alive and every vehicle intact. And the logistics push that had been deemed too important to delay arrived at the outpost without losing a single pallet. Elena went back to her workstation when the after-action reporting began, and she wrote her summary the same way she wrote every summary, in flat professional prose with no adjectives and no commentary. She submitted it to her non-commissioned officer in charge at 1900 hours, walked to the chow hall for a plate of food she barely tasted, and was in bed by 21:30 because the morning briefing read would come at 4 whether she had slept or not. The world had not changed. The work continued. But somewhere in the operations center, on the table next to the radio, her overlay still lay flat under a coffee mug, and 3 different soldiers had stopped to study it on their way out the door. The change in the unit did not happen overnight, because real change in a military organization rarely does, but it happened steadily, the way water shapes stone. Sergeant Hale came to find Elena 2 mornings later in the chow hall, sat across from her with a tray of eggs and a cup of black coffee, and said the words she had not expected to hear. He told her he had been wrong, not just about the route, but about her, and about every analyst he had ever dismissed in 22 years of service. And he asked her if she would be willing to brief his platoon directly before their next mission. She said yes, because she had never been the kind of soldier who held grudges when an apology was offered honestly, and because she understood that a sergeant first class admitting fault in public was its own kind of courage. The briefing she gave the following week was the first of many, and within a month the brigade had quietly adjusted its pre-mission planning cycle to include direct face-to-face engagement between the intelligence section and the maneuver platoons. Not just the company commanders, not just the staff. Younger soldiers began to recognize Elena in the hallway, not as the quiet woman from the operations center, but as the analyst who had called the 5 sites on Route Sapphire. And the story spread the way stories spread in deployed units, told over cigarettes and card games and long board hours on guard duty. The lesson the soldiers took away was not that one analyst had been right one time, because that would have been the small version of the lesson, and the small version of the lesson would have faded by the next rotation. The real lesson, the one that began to reshape how the unit thought about itself, was that the work happening in tents and bays and motor pools across the base was not secondary to the work happening on patrol. It was the same work. The mechanic who tightened the lug nuts at 0400 was keeping the same soldier alive as the rifleman who pulled security on his flank. The communications specialist who repositioned the retransmission site to cover the dead spot in the eastern sector was keeping the same soldier alive as the platoon medic. The supply sergeant who chased down the missing batteries, and the cook who got hot food forward to a remote outpost, and the maintenance officer who deferred her own sleep to certify a vehicle were all doing the same job as the men and women carrying rifles down a road in the afternoon heat. None of them were less. None of them were just. The word just had been the problem all along, because just was a word that hid the work, and the work was the whole point. Elena Reyes was promoted to sergeant 6 weeks before her deployment ended, pinned by a battalion commander who took the time to mention Route Sapphire by name. And she accepted the new rank the same way she had accepted everything else in her career, with a quiet nod and a promise to keep getting better. Her father called her that night on a scratchy line, and she told him about the ceremony, and he laughed in the same low way he had laughed in his kitchen all those years ago. He said only one thing she would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "The drivers always know who got them home, Mija. They just don't always say it out loud." Elena Reyes never became famous, and she never wanted to be, because fame had never been the point of the uniform she wore. She finished her career as a senior non-commissioned officer with a chest of ribbons that meant something specific to the people who could read them. And she trained a generation of younger analysts to do the same patient, unglamorous work that had once saved a convoy on a Tuesday afternoon. The soldiers who served beside her carried her lessons forward into units she would never visit, and somewhere right now, in a tent on a base in a country most civilians could not find on a map, a young specialist is reading a satellite image one more time before she submits her assessment, because someone like Elena once taught her that precision is mercy. So before you scroll past this story, I want you to think again about the question we started with. The people behind the mission, the analysts, the mechanics, the cooks, the clerks, the communicators, the planners, do they deserve the same respect as the people in front of the mission? Tell me in the comments what you think, and tell me about the quiet professional in your own life, the one who held everything together without ever asking to be seen. Because the truth Elena learned at her father's kitchen table, the truth Sergeant Hale learned on Route Sapphire, and the truth every soldier eventually learns if they serve long enough, is that the foundation is never less important than the building. It is the building, and the woman behind the map is not just support. She is the reason the mission comes home.